Let me ask you something right now. Have you ever seen a man walk into a room full of powerful people, all suits, smiles, and silent judgments, and not flinch? I'm talking about a room where every handshake is a chess move, where every smile is hiding a strategy, where everybody's watching everybody else like hawks pretending to be doves, and in the middle of all that smooth, talking theater, walks in one man who don't care for show, who don't need to bow, who don't need to beg, and who certainly ain't there to play along. That man was India's Jaishankar, and the room, the Quad Summit. See, folks out here don't understand the weight of silence. They think power comes from who shouts the loudest, who controls the camera, who drafts the press release. But true power, it walks in quiet, sits down like it owns the place, and makes folks nervous with just one look. That's what happened when Jaishankar showed up at the summit with a calm so cold it froze every calculation the United States had rehearsed. Now understand this. This it was supposed to be a moment for the West to flex. They'd lined up the optics, Australia smiling, Japan nodding politely, and America. Oh, America had its script. A nice little story about unity, democracy, and shared values. But what they didn't count on was India not clapping on cue. Jaishankar didn't come there to be impressed. He came with facts, history, and the fire of 1 billion people standing behind him. He sat at that table with a backbone made of steel and a memory long enough to remind the world what India truly is. Not some junior partner, not some silent seat filler, not a pawn in somebody else's Indo-Pacific game. No, sir, India came as India, and when Jaishankar opened his mouth, you could see it on every face in that room. They weren't ready. He didn't yell, he didn't pound the table, but his words, they cut deep, precision, clarity, confidence, like a surgeon, not a salesman, and that's what shook them. See, America's used to folks trying to please them. They're used to leaders dancing around issues, trying not to offend the big guy in the room. But Jaishankar didn't dance. He drew a line. He said, in not so many words, that India doesn't take sides. It takes stands. He reminded them that India's foreign policy isn't about echoing anyone's script. It's about safeguarding its own destiny. That was the moment, that exact moment when the U.S. delegation realized they weren't dealing with the old India, the one they thought they could sway with a few defense deals and photo ops. No, this was the new India, assertive, independent, strategic, and unapologetic. The humiliation came not from insults, but from integrity. When a man stands his ground with calm conviction while everyone else is performing, oh, that's devastating. That's the kind of blow that don't leave bruises, but it leaves scars on ego. And America, well, they got a scar that day. Now you might be wondering, what exactly did he say? Let me break it down for you in spirit, because Jaishankar ain't the kind of man who says things for applause. He says them for effect. He looked them straight in the face and made it clear that India would not be coerced into isolating nations it chooses to engage with. You want India to stop buying oil from Russia, then offer us something better. You want India to pick your battles, then respect India's right to choose peace when war profits you. And baby, that room got quiet, real quiet, because when a man puts truth on the table with no sugar, no spin, no stammering, they gotta swallow it raw. And that taste, it don't go down easy. He reminded them that India is not a charity case for Western approval. This is a nation with 5 zeros, 0 years of unbroken civilization. A nation that resisted colonization, rose from poverty, built satellites, made vaccines, fed the world, and still held onto its soul. That ain't a country you lecture, that's a country you respect. Jaishankar didn't need to talk loud because he brought something louder than volume. He brought credibility. When America talks about values, India remembers who shipped weapons to Pakistan during our wars. When they talk about democracy, India remembers how they propped up dictators in other nations. So when they tried to preach, Jaishankar handed them a mirror, and don't get it twisted. He wasn't disrespectful. He was dignified, but sometimes dignity can be more devastating than defiance, because dignity don't blink, it don't fold, it don't need to shout to shake foundations. It just sits there, immovable, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The message was simple. India's not here to follow. India's here to lead on its own terms, in its own time, and the world's gonna have to adjust. You see, folks have been underestimating India for too long. They still think of it in cliches. Neck charmers and call centers, curry and chaos. But what they're missing is that India is now a nation of coders and commandos, entrepreneurs and engineers, diplomats and disruptors. India is Silicon Valley and spiritual legacy in one breath. It's a country where the ancient and the futuristic coexist, where a monk can build an app, and a village girl can launch a startup. And Jaishankar, he ain't just a diplomat, he's a reflection of that dual strength. He's the man who reads Sanskrit scripture and quotes geopolitics in the same sentence. The man who spent decades studying the world and now makes the world study him. He's calm under fire, sharp under pressure, and when he speaks, people stop pretending. At that summit, the U.S. expected applause. Instead, they got accountability. They expected India to fall in line. Instead, India drew a new one, and what's more shocking, the rest of the world saw it. They saw the unshakable presence. They saw the polite defiance, and some of them, they started wondering if maybe India ain't just a player. Maybe India's becoming the umpire, because let me tell you, when a country like India speaks with that kind of confidence, backed by that kind of capability, you don't just listen, you rethink your position. You adjust your tone, you begin to realize this ain't the 20th century anymore. This is India's time, and India ain't asking for permission. What Jaishankar did wasn't just about geopolitics. It was about restoring balance. It was about telling the world that power can wear a suit, but it don't have to wear a Western accent, that a nation can be modern without being westernized, that it can be global without being colonized again by ideas pretending to be universal values. That was the shock of the summit. Not a scandal, not a headline, but a silent shift, a recalibration, a realization that the age of Western monopoly on morality, on influence, on leadership, is over, and India ain't coming to burn bridges. It's coming to build highways, but highways that lead on Indian terms to Indian destinations with Indian drivers behind the wheel, and let me tell you something else. This wasn't a one-off moment. This was a declaration without declaration. A message sent across every boardroom, every war room, every embassy watching that summit, that if you want to work with India now, you better come with respect in your voice and fairness in your hand. Otherwise, India's gonna walk right past you like you're a street lamp, seen, noted, but never needed, and the beauty of it all, he didn't storm out, he didn't threaten, he didn't even gloat. He just stated facts calmly, clearly, with that knowing look that says, we see the game, we know the rules, we just don't play by illusions anymore. See, that's the difference. Most leaders walk in trying to make noise. Jaishankar walked in and made asterisk sense asterisk. He didn't demand attention. He asterisk commanded asterisk it, because when you're standing on solid ground, you don't need theatrics, just truth. Now the folks in Washington, oh, they'll spin the summit. Say it was productive. Say it was warm, say it was historic, but deep down they know what happened. They know they got humbled without a slap. They know they saw the future of diplomacy, and it didn't have stars and stripes on it. It had saffron and steel, and India didn't celebrate, because when you're truly rising, you don't need fireworks, just footsteps, and India's footsteps, they're echoing now, in Tokyo, in Canberra, in Washington, and yes, even in Beijing, because when a man like Jaishankar speaks like that on the global stage, without fear, without flattery, without forgetting who he represents, the whole world listens differently. And so let me leave you with this. Power isn't about making others smaller. It's about standing tall enough that they have to look up. And India, through Jaishankar, just stood up, not to intimidate, but to illuminate, to let the world know we've arrived, we've endured, we've evolved, and now we lead quietly, steadily, unshakably, and if you ain't ready for that, then baby, that ain't India's problem anymore. It marked the birth of India's assertive military doctrine backed by innovation. The world saw a shift from U.S.-led leadership to multipolar diplomacy, led by India. This was no longer a time where India sat quietly in the back of the room, nodding along while the West directed the conversation. No, this was the day the room turned ever so slightly to face the voice that used to stay silent, and that voice belonged to India. That tone came from generations of restraint finally finding form in reasoned resolve. That posture, it was the beginning of something bigger than a diplomatic change. It was a civilizational awakening that the world could no longer see. For decades, the United States has maintained a grip on global consensus through power projection, economic dependency, and cultural narratives that put Western values at the center of international legitimacy. Washington didn't just lead alliances. It defined them, it shaped terms, it drafted language, it set expectations, and the rest of the world, they were expected to follow, sometimes with benefits, often with consequences. But in that Quad summit, something slipped, not by accident, not by conflict, but by clarity, and that clarity came from India through a doctrine not just of strategy, but of identity. India did not arrive at the table asking for permission to lead. It arrived already leading, simply waiting for the rest of the world to recognize what had already changed on the ground. While the West was busy maintaining old alliances, India had built relationships. While America emphasized power through military bases and economic sanctions, India had cultivated trust through infrastructure, medicine, space tech, and culture. When India speaks now, it's not echoing another's voice. It's speaking from its own depth, drawing from 1,000 rivers of wisdom, resilience, and relentless modernization. The shift wasn't loud. It was tectonic, subtle on the surface, yet foundational beneath. When Jaishankar stood his ground, he didn't just speak for a country. He stood for a doctrine that says India will not outsource its security thinking to anyone, that its foreign policy will not be shaped by appeasement or fear, but by alignment with national interest rooted in civilizational confidence. That doctrine no longer assumes peace will come through Western frameworks, but through strength rooted in sovereignty and innovation. It's the innovation part that the West keeps underestimating. They see Indian military strength through a 20th century lens, numbers, old hardware, second-hand partnerships. But that's not where India is going. India's investing in its own missile systems, naval deterrence, hypersonics, and satellite-based surveillance. It's fusing artificial intelligence with defense applications, developing quantum computing protocols for secure communication, and building indigenous fighter jets that rival global prototypes. And all of this, backed by a doctrine that's no longer shy about asserting itself now. When India says it doesn't need a military alliance to defend its interests, the world is forced to believe it, because that independence is no longer rhetorical, it's tactical. It's institutionalized in DRDO's breakthroughs. It's demonstrated in joint operations that India conducts on its own terms. It's proven every time India repels border threats without seeking permission or backup from any bloc. It's shown in the way India builds defense ties with Russia, the U.S., France, and Israel simultaneously, without contradiction, because India's choices are based on strategy, not subservience. This moment, this shift in posture, was never about humiliation or optics. It was about transition, a new world taking shape not through war or revolution, but through the rise of those who once waited and watched. India didn't demand that the world step aside. It simply stepped forward. It offered no apologies for not taking sides in the Ukraine war. It offered no discomfort in buying discounted Russian oil. It offered no hesitation in sending humanitarian aid to Palestine and forging strategic deals with Israel. Because this is what real diplomacy looks like in a multipolar world. It's not chaos, it's complexity, and India is mastering that complexity while the West still clings to old binaries. The Quad Summit exposed this very reality. America had hoped to use it as a showcase of Indo-Pacific solidarity, with India projected as the Eastern answer to China's expansion. But India walked into that room with a very different energy. It didn't come to balance China for America. It came to secure its own interest in the Indo-Pacific, whether that aligned with others or not. It's not about containment. It's about creation, not about being anti-anyone, but about being fully pro-India. This is where the U.S. felt the shift, not in words of confrontation, but in the loss of assumed control. For the first time, the spotlight didn't automatically belong to Washington. It had to share it. It had to accept that India was not showing up to validate old power structures, but to reshape them. And that stings for a global leader used to directing the narrative. But it's inevitable in a world where the most populous nation is now also the fastest growing major economy, a nuclear power, a space power, a tech hub, and a civilizational giant that doesn't see itself as East or West, but as original. What Jaishankar did at that summit, it wasn't just about diplomacy, it was a psychological repositioning. He brought India's growing hard power and matched it with narrative power. He didn't protest decisions, he presented positions. He didn't demand allies, he demanded understanding. And when he did that, the room changed, because it realized that India is not the swing state of the 21st century. It's the steady state. It's not a balance between extremes. It's an axis of its own, and behind that doctrine, the military posture is evolving in real time. India is shifting from a largely reactive defense model to a proactive deterrence strategy. It's not just preparing for war, it's preparing to prevent it by making the costs of aggression too high for any adversary. It's leveraging terrain, technology, and tenacity to protect its borders from the Himalayas to the seas. And it's doing this without relying on foreign bases or ideological allies, just sovereign partnerships and clear intent. The U.S. has seen this model before from itself. That's what makes India's rise so uncomfortable for some, because for the first time, another nation is using the tools of realism, restraint, and readiness without mimicking Western arrogance. It's power without paternalism, it's ambition without aggression, it's leadership without lectures. And that's threatening not because it's unstable, but because it's sustainable when you combine a doctrine that prioritizes indigenous development with a foreign policy that rejects false binaries. You get a country that can't be bullied, bought, or baited. And that is exactly what India is becoming. The humiliation, if any, at that summit wasn't in what India did. It was in how unprepared the West was for India's quiet refusal to comply with outdated expectations. They had written a script, but India rewrote the plot, and not with fury. With facts. This assertiveness isn't loud nationalism, it's strategic selfhood. It's a country finally walking in the fullness of its potential, not with fanfare but with focus. A country that doesn't have to choose between development and defense, between modernity and tradition, between aligning with the West or countering the East. India is choosing India. And that choice is creating a gravitational pull of its own nations from Africa to Latin America, from Central Asia to the Middle East, are beginning to notice that India is no longer just a participant in the global order, it's becoming an architect. Whether it's building digital payment infrastructure across Africa, leading vaccine diplomacy, or setting up semiconductor alliances with Southeast Asia. India is writing its own rules. And not out of rebellion, but out of readiness. The moment Jaishankar sat at that table and calmly laid down India's independent line, it signaled to the world that the era of unipolar diplomacy is over. This wasn't a rejection of the West, it was a reset, a pivot from dependency to parity, a demonstration that India will cooperate, but it will not comply, it will collaborate, but it will not be contained. And that subtle yet seismic shift is what the world must now adjust to, not because India demanded it, but because India deserves it. Every nation has its moment when it stops being defined by others and begins defining itself. That moment doesn't come through revolution. It comes through realization. Realization that strength doesn't require noise, that vision doesn't require validation. And that diplomacy, real diplomacy, begins not with aligning for approval, but with standing for principle. India is not chasing influence. It is becoming influential, not by confrontation, but by conviction. And when conviction shows up with capability, the old hierarchies of power have no choice but to adapt. What happened at that Quad Sum? It was not a humiliation of any one country. It was the humbling of a system that assumed leadership is permanent and influence is inherited. India reminded them it's neither. Leadership must be earned, influence must be respected, and respect. India now commands it simply by being what it is, a sovereign, strategic, and steady force that no longer waits for the world to notice, but calmly walks forward until it can no longer be ignored.